The call came on a Wednesday evening, which is the kind of detail you only remember because it matters later. I had been at my desk until nearly 8, finishing a reconciliation audit for a regional hospital network, when my phone lit up with a text from my sister Dana. It wasn't a message, exactly. It was a link to a real estate listing, a beachfront property in Kauai, 3 bedrooms, asking price just under $1 million. Beneath it, a single line, closing next week. Thanks for the contribution. I set down my coffee and read it twice. My name is Margot. I'm 36 years old, and I work in healthcare financial compliance for a consulting firm that contracts with federal oversight agencies. I am by most visible measures unremarkable. I drive a sensible car. I keep odd hours. I have a small apartment in Minneapolis that my mother, Carol, has spent years describing to her friends as cozy, which is her word for disappointing. By the time I opened my laptop, the transfer notifications had already arrived. 40 minutes earlier, while I was reviewing charge master codes on a hospital audit, someone had walked into my bank branch, presented a healthcare proxy I had signed 4 years ago during a surgery that left me briefly incapacitated, and told the branch manager I was suffering a mental health crisis. They had moved $790,000 out of a custodial account registered in my name, and routed it through my brother-in-law Theo's Consulting LLC. I did not panic. I want to be precise about that. What I felt was closer to recognition, the specific cold clarity of watching something you had always suspected. Carol had always managed the family the way certain people manage a budget, every resource accounted for, every liability assigned. I was the liability that kept producing surplus. When I earned a fellowship stipend in graduate school, she suggested I give it to Dana to cover her semester abroad. When I bought my first car, it spent 3 months in Dana's possession before coming back with a cracked rear axle. I was useful in the way a utility is useful, taken for granted until the bill came due. Theo, Dana's husband, had the particular energy of a man who had convinced himself that confidence was the same thing as competence. He ran a small hospitality consulting practice that operated mostly on the strength of his personality and an aggressive LinkedIn presence. I had reviewed enough financial disclosures in my career to understand what his was hiding. The cars were leased. The office space was shared. The private lender debt was substantial and overdue. What Carol had not understood, what neither of them had taken the time to investigate, was what kind of account they had actually accessed. The $790,000 was not my personal savings. It was a restricted custodial fund I managed under a federal compliance contract, holding recovered assets from a healthcare fraud prosecution. The account was flagged for forensic audit and sat under the oversight of a federal inspector general's office. It had a bank routing number, and my name in the account title, followed by an abbreviation neither of them had apparently bothered to read. Office of Inspector General. I opened my encrypted work terminal and pulled up the compliance dashboard. The transfer had already triggered an automated alert. A red banner was running across the top of the screen, unauthorized disbursement detected on restricted federal audit account. Tracking protocol initiated. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence of my apartment settle around me. Have you ever had the experience of watching someone walk confidently into a room that they did not realize was already a trap? My phone rang an hour later. It was Theo, FaceTiming from what appeared to be a hotel suite with ocean light pouring through the windows behind him. He was holding a drink and smiling in a way that suggested he had been rehearsing this moment. He wanted the access credentials to a secondary financial account. He was casual about it, the way people are casual when they believe all the power is on their side. He explained at length how the money had been routed through his LLC, how he had already cleared a significant portion to settle outstanding debts with private creditors, and how the remaining balance was earmarked for commercial property acquisitions on the island. I asked him one question: whether he had received the funds through a personal account or through his corporate entity. He told me, with unmistakable pride, that he had run every dollar through the LLC. He used the word clean twice. I ended the call and contacted my federal liaison, a compliance officer named Russell, who had been monitoring the account remotely. I told him the funds had crossed state lines, that the receiving party had processed them through a registered corporate structure, and that the primary account holder had admitted on a recorded line to using the business entity to obscure the transfer origin. Russell's response was brief. That changes the classification. We'll move tonight. What followed was the kind of bureaucratic precision that looks nothing like the movies. There were no dramatic phone calls, no ultimatums issued. I simply sat at my desk and watched the compliance dashboard update in real time, as the federal financial system did what it was designed to do. Within 90 minutes of my call with Russell, Theo's corporate accounts were frozen. His personal accounts followed. Every card linked to his financial profile returned the same response. Do not honor. Contact issuing bank. My phone began ringing. Carol first, then Dana, then Theo again, the calls arriving in escalating frequency and desperation. I answered my mother's third attempt and said nothing when she picked up. I wanted to hear the exact register of her panic before I offered a single word. She told me to fix it. Then she cried. Then she told me that Dana was pregnant, and that the stress would harm the baby. Then she told me that I owed this to the family, that I lived alone, that my life was small and my needs were few, and that the least I could do was absorb this consequence for people who had more to lose. I let her speak until she had nothing left. Then I told her, very quietly, that I hadn't frozen anything. That I didn't have the authority to lock a federally restricted account from my kitchen. That the automated systems of a federal oversight office had done it the moment the transfer cleared the reserve. And then I told her what the account actually was. The silence that followed had a particular quality, not the silence of disbelief, but the silence of a structure collapsing inward. Theo got on the line and threatened me. He said he would call my employer and report that I was mentally unstable. He said he had lawyers. He said he would bury me in civil litigation. He escalated through every available form of intimidation with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. Before I ended the call, I warned him not to attempt to move the remaining funds in smaller increments. I told him the algorithms flagged rapid divided transfers immediately. I said it because I knew he would do it anyway. Men like Theo hear warnings as instructions. 42 transactions. All under $10,000. He moved them in under an hour, paying off private creditors whose accounts were already known to federal investigators. When Russell messaged me that night, his text contained only a number 42. And then smurfing confirmed. Case is sealed. 3 days later, a federal public defender named Patrick called my office. He introduced himself as Carol's court-appointed attorney, which told me everything I needed to know about the current state of her finances. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they're trying to locate your sympathy without directly asking for it. He said she was struggling. He said she was asking for my forgiveness. He asked if I would write a letter of leniency to the presiding magistrate. I told him I would submit a victim impact statement. I told him it would be thorough, accurate, and without a single sentence of mitigation. He asked if I had anything I wanted him to pass along. I thought about the text Dana had sent me. Thanks for the contribution. I thought about 4 years of carrying a healthcare proxy that my mother had apparently been treating as a promissory note. I told him that adults are responsible for the consequences of their choices. That's all. The sentencing hearings were held on a Tuesday morning in November. Theo received 4 years in a federal correctional facility and the permanent revocation of his business licenses. Carol received 2.5 years and a federal fraud notation that would follow her credit profile for the rest of her life. Dana, who had cooperated with prosecutors and delivered a plea agreement that sacrificed both of them, avoided incarceration but left the courthouse with a bankruptcy filing, 0 liquid assets, and a custody evaluation pending for a child from a prior relationship that her mother had helped her conceive. Lull from family court. I sat in the gallery and watched the gavel come down 3 times, and I felt something I had not felt in years. The specific unencumbered stillness of a person. 6 months later, I signed the closing documents on a 2-bedroom condominium in a building with a good elevator and a view of the river. It was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine before. Not leveraged, not compromised, not contingent on anyone else's approval or need. I stood at the window the night I moved in with a glass of wine and nothing specific to think about, which was, I don't tell this story as a lesson, exactly. I tell it because I spent a long time believing that the discomfort of holding a boundary was evidence that I was doing something wrong. It took someone stealing from a federal oversight account to make me understand that the discomfort was just the sound of a door closing. If there's a question worth sitting with, it's this. How long have you been absorbing someone else's consequences in the name of keeping the peace, and whose peace exactly were you protecting?